We talked about some of this stuff before when we talked about the mutually assured destruction psychology that the Cold War gave us. And we've actually talked about this stuff before, but we're going to go a bit deeper into it. What happens when your adversary defines the very concept of survival completely differently than you do? And this is where we're actually going to take the language angle on this, and we're going to look at it in terms of the Clash of Dictionaries. And this is the point where the usual idea of deterrence, making that enemy afraid of consequences that we would think of as consequences, it stops working. And it shatters entirely that architecture of the Western global security mindset, the legacy of the Cold War, this mad idea we're talking about. That premise is built on the idea that everyone wants to live. Everyone wants to see tomorrow. They have a strong preference for it.
But the underlying ideology of the resistance axis, the network of these groups, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, kind of like all these, the proxy groups from Iran, ideologically and financially, they are anchored by the radical elements of the Iranian revolutionary regime. And in their radical revolutionary Islamic ideology, the struggle against the West, the grey Satan, they call it, and Israel, which is the little Satan, it's not a standard geopolitical conflict over borders or water rights or resources. It's not a war that can be solved by drawing a new line on a map. It's a cosmic moral law. And this is where the rules fundamentally change.
Yes, psychologists call it sacred values conflict, when the fight's no longer about survival, but what you believe that must never be compromised. And it's a cosmic war. And in a cosmic war, the very definition of death changes drastically and profoundly. And in this specific theological worldview, dying is the struggle against perceived cosmic corruption. It's not a loss, and it's not a tragedy to be avoided. Dying is martyrdom, and the ultimate spiritual victory is through the gates of martyrdom, through the gates of death in this view. A direct passage to eternal glory, spiritual transcendence, a guarantee of paradise for you and your family, and God's will being done on earth. So, I don't know, what does that look like when we game it out in a military game exercise? If you're sitting across the geopolitical chessboard from an adversary whose leadership genuinely values martyrdom over earthly survival, how do you deter them with the threat of death?
You can't. The mass doesn't work that way. It's a different way of thinking. If the enemy views death as this kind of promotion rather than penalty, the entire concept of deterrence breaks down, doesn't it?
So if a radical leadership genuinely believes that dying in a nuclear fireball while simultaneously destroying their ultimate enemy guarantees paradise and fulfills a divine mandate, you can't rely on them being rational in the Western secular humanist sense of the word.
And that brings us straight back to these solid fuel missiles. If you believe your adversary sees the world in an absolute term, God versus good versus corruption, good versus evil, God versus the rest of the world that you see as evil. And you watch them build missiles that can launch in minutes. You don't get the luxury of waiting to see if deterrence works, do you? Because if deterrence fails, there's no reset. There's no second attempt. And that's the end of the game.
So what looks like recklessness from the outside, which we've heard repeatedly said, recklessness, is from the inside an attempt to avoid the only outcome you can't survive. And you don't want to be proven right. You act before you can be proven wrong. And this is a disconnect. The same facts, but completely different conclusions. So what one side calls escalation, actually what we call is escalation in the West maybe, the other is calling it survival. And that gap, that inability to read the other side's logic is what we're going to talk about in the Tower of Babel, in international diplomacy. Yeah,
so we're going to talk about the Tower of Babel, and we're going to at last open our Bibles to something here, because this is what we're all about, really.